Good morning, LifeBridge. Thanks for being here this morning. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online. I'm so glad that you are here with us. Before we jump in to our series here, first of all, I want to thank you. Those of you that participated in Lunchbox Love last week, we got to give out over 200 lunches and just be a blessing to people, like provide a miracle for so many people in this country who don't know where their next meal's coming from, and we were able to provide that. So thanks for being a part of that. I know I have talked with several of you, and just the stories that you're telling me are just amazing to hear how we were able to bless people, and not only do that, but in return, you were encouraged. And so our hope is to continue to do things like that in the future. And so I hope that you will keep an eye out for that. So last week we started this series called Stranger Things. And we're looking at the strange things in the Bible. Particularly the miracles that we read about in the Gospels. And miracles, they're strange things. And the miracles we read about in the Bible, I mean, they are really strange. I mean, all of a sudden, blind people can see, sick people are suddenly healed. You know, water becomes wine with just a prayer, and it's like some really strange things that you read about. And what we ended up seeing is that miracles are something that point us to God, and they point us to His goodness. And a miracle only accomplishes its purpose when it points back to God. A miracle is only fulfilled when we recognize God, when we recognize His goodness. So a miracle could be something small, like getting a parking spot at the mall on a Friday night when it's payday, and or it could be something big, like you or someone that you know was sick and suddenly they're healed. And the point was that of last week was that perhaps maybe we need to change our mindset of understanding what miracles are. We need to redefine what a miracle is and take notice of the miracles that are happening all around us. And so as we are going through this series, as we read about the miracles, what we're learning and what we're discovering is that we are being led by clue, sign by sign. And all of these miracles, they're pointing to something or someone greater. And the greatest miracle of all is this earth-shattering event that takes place in history. So I hope that you'll stay with us as we go through this series. Last week, like I said, I love the book of John when it comes to miracles. And John, he writes his book, and as he writes, it's like a multi-layered story. It's like some of you might want to think of it like a cake with like lots of different layers, right? And John he writes very different than the rest of the writers in the Gospels, because John writes as an eyewitness to these miracles that Jesus performed. John was a guy who was really close to Jesus, and so he writes from a very different perspective than the rest of the Gospels. John writes with great authority. He's not so concerned about the details of things like Luke and Matthew are, but he uses a lot of symbolism and imagery. And I mean, last week I talked a little bit about this. This week I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. Next week we're going to talk a little bit more about this imagery and symbolism that John uses in his book. But John, at the end of his book, he tells you why he wrote his book, why he chose to follow Jesus. And he didn't choose to follow Jesus because he had faith in Jesus. He didn't follow Jesus because Jesus one day came to him and said, "Hey man, you just got to believe and follow me." No, John didn't do that. John left a successful business. His father was a fisherman. He was a successful fisherman. John left that successful life of being a fisherman, and he followed a carpenter named Jesus. And John writes this book because he wants you and I to know exactly why Jesus did all these strange things. Why did Jesus do what he did? Why did Jesus come in the first place? And why did it happen the way that it did? And at the end of the book of John, John tells us the reason why he wrote this book. He says this: the disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs, meaning Jesus didn't do these things in hiding. Jesus didn't do these things like, well, no one was watching. Jesus did them in front of a few. And like we saw last week, he did them in front of thousands. And so the disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones that are recorded in this book. That means this book is the book that John is writing. All right, John's gospel. And you and we've come to the end of his book, and John tells us that, hey, what I've told you, this is only just a fraction of what Jesus did. This is only just a little bit of what Jesus said and what Jesus did. Jesus said a whole lot more. Jesus did a whole lot more than this. But he says, I have written these things down. I've recorded them in this book, so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. So it's not just so that you will know what Jesus said. It's not just so that you will know what Jesus did. John says, hey, I wrote all of these things down so that you will believe. John wants you and I to be convinced that Jesus is who he claims to be. And John would go on to tell us the result of placing our faith in Jesus. The result is that by believing him, by believing that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. That means that you and I, we won't just have any life. We just won't have a random life, but you and I, we can experience life to the fullest. You and I, we can experience the more that God talks and wants for us. Life that experiences more in that power that Jesus has. The same power that Jesus used to do all these strange things, these miracles in the Bible, because it was what John saw that convinced him that Jesus was who he says he was. That it's what John saw, it's what John experienced that made him believe and then ultimately come to trust Jesus. And so as you read through the book of John, John kind of organizes his book this way. John says, hey, I witnessed these events. I saw these miracles. I saw these signs. And I'm going to tell you why John calls them signs in just a bit here. But these events and these signs and these miracles, they served as evidence. And because of the evidence, because of what I saw, John tells us, I believed that Jesus was who he claimed to be. And it's because I believe, because of the evidence, because of the signs, because of the miracles, because of the events. And here's why this is so important. He says, I trusted in that because of these things. He said, and this is why it's so important for us. Because John didn't place his trust in Jesus and then say, well, I hope it all works out for me. It wasn't like, hey, I trust in you, Jesus, and then I just pray and hope and believe that things are going to be okay. No. John says, I saw this. I witnessed this. I experienced this. And this is the evidence that caused me to believe in who Jesus is. And that's why I put my trust in him. And John is telling you and me, he says, if it's good enough for me, I hope that it's good enough for you. And this is why I wrote these things down. So what he does is in his book, and he's just not giving us these random events and random things, conversations that Jesus had. He organizes his book around what he calls signs. And specifically, John, as you read through his gospel, he's going to talk about 7 signs. We're talking about the majority of those 7 signs in this series, but these signs, these strange things are that Jesus did point to who Jesus is. Now, John uses the word sign rather than miracle, and this is really important that we understand why John used the word sign rather than miracle. Because we read these strange things that Jesus did. We read about the feeding of the 5,000. We read about Jesus walking on water. We read about all these things. And they weren't just random acts of kindness. It wasn't just Jesus showing off like, hey, look at how cool I am. Look at all this power that I have. No, they were signs that pointed to who Jesus was. Now, you and I, we read the book of John, and what happens is we tend to focus on these things that Jesus did. We focus on these miracles that Jesus did. And we focus on them especially in our circumstances, in our context. Because we all want a miracle in our life. We all at some point want a miracle to happen in our life. A time when you know you want God to show up and you want God to do something that only God can do. But John, he says, hey, it's a mistake to focus on the miracles. John knows it's a mistake to focus, he says, the purpose of the miracle. This is why he calls it a sign. It's a sign that points us to Jesus. These miracles are what point us to Jesus. So he writes about these signs, these miracles to point us to the identity of Jesus. And John does the best job to help us not become enamored or to become focused on the miracles, but to rather be focused, to become enamored with the person of Jesus. But let's be real for a second here. The truth is, you and I, we're drawn to these kinds of miracles. We're enamored with these supernatural things that happen because miracles do something in us, right? Like we want to, there's something unbelievable. There's something impossible to happen. Something supernatural that has just taken place, right? And why are we drawn to miracles? Why are we enamored with miracles? It's because at some point in our life, you and I, we want a miracle in our life. We want to be on the receiving end of something that only God could do. We want to be able to tell the story about this miraculous time when God showed up and it seemed impossible. It's unbelievable. And so we read these stories in John and we clearly see that God is in the business of doing miracles. But it causes you and I to wonder like, well, where's my miracle then? Why haven't I gotten my miracle? When do I get my miracle? Phil Anders was a man who had a great impact on my life. He was an elder at my previous church, and he was a humble man. He was always willing to help. He was hardworking and extremely generous with his time, his talents, his money. He would often drive our bus 3 hours to camp and drop us off and drive back home. And I admired his wisdom, his faith, and one of the things I admired the most about Phil was his faithfulness to prayer. He would drop us off at camp and he would pray for me and he'd pray for the students. And then he says, as I drive back home, I'm going to pray for each student. And I'm going to pray for each of your leaders. And I'm going to pray for the speaker. I'm going to pray for every single part of camp. Phil was a great man. About 5 years ago, Phil was diagnosed with this aggressive esophagus cancer. And when he was diagnosed, our whole church was praying. Phil was a very influential man. And so people anyone that knew that Phil was sick was praying for him. And we didn't just pray for him like for a day or for a week. We prayed for months for Phil. And we prayed for years that he would be healed of cancer. But Phil never got his miracle. At age 63, in May of 2019, he died. Now, I don't know about you. There's a part of me that gets really angry at that. Because I think about Phil, and I wonder, God, you're able to do the impossible. So why would you not heal a good man like Phil? Why would you not save him? And I don't know about you, but I hear other stories like Phil's, and I wonder, okay, God, when it comes to miracles, why don't you do them more often? Why don't you save more people like Phil? Instead, there's other people out there that are benefiting from things in life, and they're not faithful to you. So why doesn't God do something miraculous to people who are so godly and committed? Why couldn't God heal Phil? Because then the whole church, everyone who knew about Phil, they could point to Phil and say, look what God did in Phil's life. You need to believe in God. You need to believe in the power of Jesus. God, why don't you do that? And the truth is, you probably have stories about that too. Stories about when you wish, God, I knew you could have showed up. It was a time you could have shown in just how powerful you are. You could have showed up in my parents' marriage or in my family. You could have done something impossible. There was a time in your life when you needed a miracle, and what happened? God didn't show up the way that you wanted him to. And I'm sure you wonder, why is it that God chooses to get involved sometimes and then other times he doesn't? You read through the Gospels, and as you read between the lines of Jesus' miracles, you'll read about people who got their miracle. You'll read about people who are sick and blind, and Jesus healed them. But as you read these miracles, you can't help but wonder, I wonder how many blind and sick and paralyzed people Jesus had to step over before he came to the guy at the pool and said, pick up your mat and walk. How many people did he walk past? I wonder about the people that Jesus didn't get to. I wonder about the people who heard about the power and the authority and all these great things that Jesus was doing, but Jesus never made it to their town. Jesus never made it to their village. Jesus never made it to their house. What about those people who didn't get their miracle? Because the truth is, we read about a lot of miracles that Jesus did. But he also left a lot of miracles undone. And so it makes us wonder, hey, if God is in the business of doing miracles, how come some people get their miracles and others don't? When God doesn't do what we want or what we expect God to do, it causes so many of us to ask, okay, God, where are you? Are you really there? Do you really care? We question if God, do you really love me? Because if you loved me, you would do this. So if it wasn't already difficult to speak on supernatural things, this is some of the questions I would like to answer this morning. Because at some point, all of us have wanted a miracle. Maybe you even expected God to do a miracle. Someone was sick. Someone was in trouble. And so what do? You pray, you pray, you pray. And you're just not like praying like little like, hey, thank you, God, for this food kind of prayers. You're praying desperate prayers. You're like, God, please heal them. God, I know you can do that. God, I beg you. God, can you hear me? God, please do something. God, please show up. I mean, desperate prayers. At some point, we've all prayed these kinds of prayers. And if you've prayed these kinds of prayers, I want you to know that there's people who have also prayed these same desperate prayers. There was a situation where two sisters found themselves in a similar situation when their brother Lazarus was sick. And Lazarus he didn't just have a runny nose or a cough. Lazarus was deathly ill. And what makes this story even more unique is that these two sisters, Mary and Martha, I mean, they weren't just random people in Scripture. Mary and Martha, I mean, they were friends of Jesus. They hung out with Jesus. They were close with him. They hung out with the disciples. And which makes this story really strange. Because Lazarus is sick, and so what do Mary and Martha do? They do what you and I would do. They prayed. They sent a message to Jesus. And the message wasn't just like, hey, Jesus, I just want you to know that Lazarus is sick. No. This was a desperate message to Jesus. They didn't want to just let Jesus know, hey, this is going on. They wanted Jesus to come and do something. So they send this urgent message to Jesus. And do you know what happens next when Jesus hears the message? You know what Jesus does? Nothing. In fact, Jesus hears the message and he doesn't rush off to their house. Instead, he stays right where he is for the next 2 days. I mean, that's not something you would expect from someone who was such a close friend to Jesus, right? So by the time Jesus actually shows up at Lazarus' house, Lazarus has been dead. And it's not like Jesus shows up and he's like, okay, let's try CPR right now, that's not what was happening. Lazarus had been dead for 4 days by the time Jesus shows up. Now, if you're friends with Jesus and you knew Jesus was capable of what and you've witnessed these things, you've experienced these things, and then you hear that he chose not to come, would you be happy with him? Probably not. And of course, these two sisters, they're not too happy either. John 11, verse 20, it says this: when Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. But Mary stayed in the house. So Martha... Mary hears that Jesus is coming. She leaves the house to go see Jesus. Martha is so hurt, so disappointed, that she storms out of the house to confront Jesus. But sorry, I mixed up that. Mary stays back. She doesn't even want to go out to greet Jesus. And Martha, she explodes right there and tells Jesus, I'm going to tell you exactly what's on my mind. Lord, if you had only been here, if you had only showed up, if you had only been a friend, my brother wouldn't have died. God, Jesus, Where in the world have you been? And Martha probably had spent time with Jesus. She had probably saw that not everyone always got what they wanted. She many times had witnessed Jesus slip through the crowds when the lines and people were just trying to barge into places for Jesus to heal them. There were other miracles that she benefited from. And so she knew how miracles worked. But why didn't Jesus give her miracle? I mean, this was life or death. And she was a friend of Jesus. Maybe there's been a time in your life that you've kind of said the same thing that Martha said to Jesus. Where were you, God? Where have you been? Why aren't you doing something? God, if you would have only showed up, this situation wouldn't be like it is right now. Maybe it was for your grandmother to be healed. Maybe it was for a date to the wedding. Or it was you needed God to show up just to pay rent. Maybe you wanted that new job that you applied for, but God didn't do what you wanted. God didn't show up like you expected him to show up, and it makes us wonder, God, where are you? God, do you even care? Maybe you've been so hurt, so mad, so disappointed in God that, like Mary, you said, I'm not going to even go. I don't even want to go to church. I don't even want to get near you. I don't even want to talk to you. And you've walked away from God. You've ignored God. But then Martha says something that changes everything. She says, but even now, even though my brother's dead now for 4 days, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. You see, Martha admits in that moment, even though I don't like my current circumstances, even though this is not what I want, I know that you're in control. You see, Martha has trust in Jesus in that moment. There's confidence in Jesus. That even though that life is not going the way that she wants it to, even though Jesus is not answering the prayers that she wants, or Jesus is not doing the miracles and not acting the way that she would like him to work, she says, I trust you. And she would go on to say, I have always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world. In other words, I trust you. I trust you, Jesus. I know who you are, and I know what kind of power you have. I've seen you all do all kinds of miracles. I've seen you heal people and provide for people. And even though I have not gotten what I wanted, I know that you're still trustworthy. In the midst of brokenness, in the midst of disappointment, she tells Jesus, I still trust you. Martha, just like John, who wrote the book, she participated in events. She saw the signs, she saw the miracles, and it was evidence that hey, this is I know I'm not in control, but these signs, these miracles, these events that have taken place, they point to someone, they point to something much bigger. They're clues that lead to something much bigger. And I believe that you are who you say you are. And because of the evidence, because of the signs, because of the miracles, because of the events, I know you're trustworthy. You see, Martha didn't place her trust in Jesus and then hope for the best. Martha had seen it, experienced it, and said, I know you're trustworthy. Martha shows us what to do when things don't go our way. When circumstances don't line up the way that we want them to. As she goes to Jesus, she leaves the house, she goes to him. And you know what? She's honest with Jesus. She doesn't pretend like everything was perfect. You know, she's real, she's raw, she's open. She's like, God, Jesus, I'm frustrated with you. And we need to understand that God has big shoulders. He can carry that. He knows that. He's secure. He can handle our emotions because he already knows. But then finally she trusts in Jesus. In the end, whether she got what she wanted or what she or not, she recognized and she knew and she trusted that Jesus, you are in control. You know what's best. You see, a miracle, we have to remember, is not about getting what we want or what we think we deserve. A miracle points to God. A miracle points to his goodness. A miracle happens when we recognize who God is. We recognize that he's powerful. We recognize that he's in control. And he can do a miracle. But he can also choose not to. Now, in this story, Jesus brings Lazarus back to life. He does a miracle. He does what Mary and Martha wanted in the first place. But before that happens, Jesus does something that so often we read over in this story. And we miss the magnitude of what is happening. Before Jesus walks up to the tomb and brings Lazarus out of the tomb, we read in John 11:35, it says this, Jesus wept. And this is so important. Because this gives us insight into who Jesus is. Jesus walks up to the grave and he weeps. If you ever wanted to memorize the Bible, this is probably the easiest verse to memorize. But memorize it knowing that it gives us insight into who God is. What the character of Jesus is. It shows us that Jesus cares. He deeply cares. It shows us that Jesus is approachable, that we can go to him, that we can be honest with him, that we can tell him where we're hurt, we can tell him where we're disappointed, we can tell him that we're mad at him and we're angry. But we can be convinced that God will always love us. He deeply cares about what is happening in our lives. And if he doesn't answer our prayer the way that we wanted to, it doesn't mean that God's not there. It doesn't mean that God doesn't care. It doesn't mean that God's not paying attention, because he is. He knows, and he's with you. You can always trust God. God always knows what's best, and he knows what you're going through, and he deeply, deeply cares for you. So in the midst of that pain, in the midst of that frustration and anger, in the midst of unanswered prayers and asking God why, we need to know that he cares. And today, I don't know what you walked into this room with. I don't know what burdens you're carrying. I don't know, those of you that are sitting at home, I don't know what is going through your mind, the disappointments that you have in God. Maybe right now you're even angry at God. Can I just tell you, I know Jesus loves you. He cares for you. But what we need to understand is what John is trying to get us to understand about miracles. It's not about the miracle itself. It's about who Jesus is. And that we can trust him no matter what circumstances are happening in our life. Don't focus on the miracle. Don't focus on getting what you want. Focus on Jesus. Be enamored with who Jesus is. Because if we get our miracle, or if we don't, we can always trust in Jesus. We can always trust that he knows what's best. Be confident in Jesus' character. Know that Jesus cares even when you don't get what you want. When we understand that miracles point to God and that they point to who Jesus is and that he can do what we want or he can choose not to, we better understand the purpose of miracles. Miracles point us to God. Point us to a God who loves us and cares for us, a God who is full of hope, a God who is active, a God who's alive. And the truth is, God knows that you need that miracle in your life. In fact, he knows the whole world needs a miracle. And it breaks his heart so much to see a broken world. And that's the reason why he sent Jesus. To show you and I just how much he loves us. It breaks his heart to know that there's so much brokenness in our lives. There's so much brokenness in the world. But we need to remember God didn't intend for the world to be this way. God designed the world and created the world much different than how you and I experience the world. And so that's why sometimes he shows up in some strange supernatural ways. And God shows up and it's as if God's saying, hey, I just want you to know, I'm still here. I love you. And I care about you. I'm still paying attention. I haven't given up on you. But it also means when God doesn't show up the way that we want him to, we can be confident that he cares, that he's there. So every time we do witness a miracle, it's an invitation for you and I to look for God, to see God. And when God doesn't necessarily give us what we want, we can remember that God is alive and active. God is present and he's personal. God cares and he's concerned with what's happening in your life. Band, you can come on up. So, as we finish, this is my challenge for you this week. Each day this week, each day, I encourage you to write 5 things in your day. At the end of every day, 5 things that point you to God's goodness. What are the 5 things that happen in the day that you're thankful for that point you to God's goodness? It could be that you opened up your fridge and you had food. There's certainly a lot of people who can't do that. Maybe it's just a simple thing that, hey, I have a bed to sleep in. I have a home. I have a roof over my head. I mean, that's God's goodness to you. But it could be something bigger, like God, thank you for my job. Thank you that my aunt is not sick anymore. Thank you that I'm not living paycheck to paycheck anymore. God, thank you that I have a healthy marriage. I have a healthy relationship with my spouse. God, thank you that I know my parents, that I can have a connection with them. God, thank you that I don't hate myself anymore like I used to. You see, once we start to thank God for His goodness in our life, it brings into perspective who God is and how much He cares for us. So that's my challenge to you. Every day, 5 things in your life that point to God's goodness. And take a few minutes to thank God for those 5 things. Give God credit for those things and for being involved in your life. But know that you might not get everything that you wanted. You might not get everything that you ask for. You may not see the miracle that you want to see. But you can still know that God is good. That God cares. That He's with you. And He's moving. And He will continue to bless you and provide for you. But it also reveals God's character. God's character is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He's still the same loving God that provided for you 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And you can still depend on Him. Miracles give us a reminder that God is who He says He is. And when we put so much hope in a miracle, we miss the miracle worker. And that's what miracles are for. They point us to Jesus, not to that event, not to that miracle. So let's be focused on who Jesus is. Father God, thank you for your Son Jesus. Thank you for